wished I could go to the wild. The wild? Whoa!
Into the Wild, in both the book and the movie, tells the story of Chris McCandless, or McCandless, a 24-year-old who forsakes his parents' money and his possessions to enter the Alaskan wilderness. Spoiler warning, he does not make it out and brutally dies of starvation. In my opinion, the book does a far better job of dissecting why McCandless sentenced himself to death and the way it impacts all of those he meets on his journey to Alaska. I'd go as far as saying that the movie is a bad movie, regardless of how much better the book is. What's up, YouTube? Jim Comics here. Remember to like, subscribe, and comment down below whether or not you've heard of Chris McCandless. Without any more dilly-dally, let's get into the wild. See what I did there? And dissect why the book is way better than the movie. And I'll give you my overall opinion on the movie Into the Wild. So let's get into the wild. A couple of weeks ago, I spent my spring break reading through Into the Wild, the novel by John Cracker, on the beach. For those who don't know, it's an account of the true story of Chris McCandless, and I already mentioned earlier what happened to him. The story is oddly but justly formatted, with the narrative cutting between McCandless and the wild, accounts of people he knew from before he died, and accounts of people he knew after he died. The book is basically set up like a documentary, divided into episodes or chapters, based on which of McCandless' allies is being focused on. As such, I assumed that Into the Wild, the movie, would similarly be set up, like a documentary, or at the very least a movie that keeps jumping between time periods, like Arrow. Instead, the movie was set up like a straightforward plot, which completely robs this story of the layers it inherently has, like onions. We'll get to the plot in a second, but first let's discuss what the movie does do decently. The cast of the movie is actually pretty good. The actor who portrays Chris, Emil Hirsch, I'm assuming that's how I pronounce his name, does a fine enough job of portraying an individual who is completely out of touch with society and yearns for the days of the past where life was less superficial and less comfortable. William Hurt, who recently died, rest in peace, you prince, plays Chris McCandless' dad, arguably the second most important character in this story, as his parents do play a major role in why he runs off into the wild. Hurt does a good job, but I wish we got to see his dad a lot more. In the book, due to flashbacks, we get to see his dad after Chris's death and how it's impacted him. His dad was always a cranky person, but you can truly feel his anger and remorse after losing Chris in the book. Meanwhile, the movie barely focuses on him before Chris dies, and it never focuses on him after Chris dies. I'll get to more of that later. The rest of the cast is just pretty alright. Kristen Stewart, whatever you pronounce her name like, plays a minor named Tracy who had a crush on Chris, and he obviously rejected her because she's a minor. But she's barely in the book, so it feels kind of pointless to be such a big focus in the movie. The only other standout I can think of is Vince Vaughn as Wayne Westerberg, but in my opinion, Vaughn is always a great actor, so that shouldn't be a surprise. Plus, Wayne was one of my favorite people in the book because he was one of Chris's first allies on his trip to Alaska, and has a lighthearted nature to him that Vince Vaughn really does capture. Besides the cast, the visuals in this movie are decent, with the Alaskan wilderness and camera angles being passable at best. The music is also pretty neat, because many of the vocalized songs are very original and country, so if you like country music, that's good for you, but country is just not something for me. But I will give props to their efforts in writing original country songs for this movie. Another good aspect is... Oh wait, that's it. Besides the cast, visuals, and music, this movie is pretty terrible. It's easily the worst book adaptation I've ever seen, and there is not one other redeeming quality about this movie. Like I mentioned earlier, the structure of this movie is completely distinct from the book, and for the worse in my opinion. And in no way does it justify this distinction. About a quarter of the book focuses on the way other people respond to Chris's death. However, the movie literally ends when Chris dies. It ends with him shutting his eyes and the screen fades to black. The entire movie focuses solely on his journey to Alaska and ends with him iconically dying in a bus. It boggles my mind that they would omit so much content from the book, especially considering how slow and tedious this movie gets near the middle. You can tell they wanted more content, and they had more content. They just decided not to use it. There were literally parts where, since I watched the movie Adaptation on Netflix, I played it at 2 times speed because the plot was moving at a snail's pace. The fix for this was so easy, as they could have literally had Chris die at the end of Act 2, about an hour and a half through the movie, and spent the last third of the movie focusing on how his loved ones and friends reacted, Or, if they wanted to be meta, they could have spent time focusing on John Cracker's efforts to investigate Chris's death. Sort of like how the movie Zodiac ends with Robert Graysmith publishing the non-fiction book that the movie is based off of. You could have some layers of Inception going on here. Besides that botched ending, ruined structure, and a sluggish pace, the movie keeps insisting that Chris really wants to have deep relationships, which, while a great idea on paper to implement, since it wasn't that much of a focus in the book, I still don't think they executed it all too well. There are parts where Chris looks into diner windows and sees men with groups of friends around them, or a lover next to them, and imagines his face on that man's face. What am I watching? This is definitely an element of what led Chris into the wild, but I do not think it was so important that they would pull something as corny as this and skip out on so much important aspects of the book, so many other important things that they could have inserted into this movie. By far, the worst part of this movie adaptation is how it refuses to acknowledge an essential question in the narrative of Into the Wild, which is the cause of Chris McCandless' death. The answer to this question is sort of still in the air, as Chris McCandless' cause of death was definitely starvation, but the reason as to why he starved when there were so many animals and plants readily available to him at this time is a legitimate question that people still ponder. In the book, the conclusion is drawn that he accidentally ate something poisonous, whether it was the potato buds he ate or the fungi that grew on them. The movie does absolutely nothing to acknowledge this fundamental question in the story of McCandless, let alone giving us an answer to it. And when a movie barely acknowledges the main question that a celebrity is surrounded by, then it fails as a biopic. It's a bad biopic. There is no way it can be redeemed if it fails to give us answers to the questions we're here for, or at least give us information about how he could have died. Like so many of the problems this movie has, it's not a deal breaker on its own, but combined with all the other blunders it makes, capsizes this as both a movie, a biopic, obviously, and an adaptation of the book. With all that being said, I'd give this movie a 2 out of 10, since as aforementioned, the cast, visuals, and music make it somewhat bearable. And I'll give it a D on the entertainment scale, because like I said, I got so bored during the second act, and the third act was not any better. I would not recommend watching this movie unless you are absolutely fascinated with the history of Chris McCandless. Even then, go read the book instead. It'll take longer, but trust me, it'll be much more worth the effort. With that being said, remember to like, subscribe, and comment down below, and be on the lookout for a Doctor Strange 2 video out by Friday. JM Comics, out.